Welcome. Today, Chuck and Brock take time to talk about contemporary ideas in theology and philosophy, specifically Zygmunt Bauman's idea of liquid modernity.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we're talking specifically about the confessional church. So that certainly puts some boundaries on what it is that we're seeing. And I think I would agree that there is some pressure from the hyper confessional. There's some pressure from those who want to completely just release any bonds of confessionalism. And then I actually think that there is a third trend that to me is as concerning, which is, and I'm not, and maybe I'll be interested in what you think about this. I don't know whether it's connected to one of these other two or it's function of these two sort of fighting against each other. But I'm also concerned about within confessional churches, a loss of even a sense of the importance of the confessions. And so therefore a loss of doctrinal knowledge, a loss of Bible knowledge, and it not being particularly a result of trying to go in a particular direction. Like what you described, that external threat of people really trying to get rid of the confessions and get rid of any sense of boundaries. I'm not necessarily seeing that all of that threat to confessionalism and doctrine is necessarily all coming from that. But there's also a sense, I think, where people just don't take it that seriously, don't spend the time studying it. I was just having a conversation yesterday in that regard. It seems to have been a generational thing in that generation that came of age in the 60s, perhaps as a reaction to a feeling that there was from their parents and others a dead orthodoxy. Not so sure that it's actually true. One of the discussions that I was having with somebody was how it's amazing to us that we can look at these church library collections that have been donated by people who now have passed, people from that pre-World War II generation, where it was very clear that they were studying very carefully and even without a great deal of education, spent a lot of time reading and studying theology and trying to apply it. And yet somehow their children seem to think that was dead orthodox somehow. And maybe there was a sense in which there was a lack of good communication. Perhaps some of the generational things that every change in generation deals with played a role in that. But then there was such a reaction that people just didn't care that much about theology. And we heard from a lot of people like that, oh, that pastor, he's too theological, or why can't we just have more topical preaching? Not that topical preaching in and of itself is a bad thing, but all they want to do. And now there's a move back to doing some things differently, but yet where we don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge of doctrine and a lot of knowledge of the confession, that makes it hard to do that. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. In fact, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just suggesting that there may be a third challenge there in addition to the two that you've described. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to go beyond that because we're almost to our hour, and I want you to get to where you were going. But that's my reaction.
I have a suspicion that we're not going to quite get there in this session. So maybe this gets to continue. And I apologize for that. But there are some things to unpack that are not, you have to really talk about those first before you get into things to avoid confusion, misunderstanding. Around 100 years ago, maybe let's put it, around the death of Herman Bavinck, around the time of the beginning of the ministry of Karl Barth, perhaps Western civilization faced let me rephrase that, perhaps Western Christian orthodoxy, especially confessional orthodoxy, faced maybe a similar situation, a similar challenge. And Karl Barth famously wanted the third way between the liberalism of his day, of which he was once a part. Karl Barth was at one point a socialist. And then he wanted to find that middle ground, that third way between the socialism and liberalistic tradition and the old dead conservative orthodox. So maybe in some sense this is not new. And precisely the step I want to avoid is precisely the step that Karl Barth took. And that was, given a choice between A and B, Barth chose C. And for my part, I don't see anything wrong with the confessional church simply because its standards have fallen out of the cultural ethos. As a matter of fact, I almost want to make them, it makes them more relevant and more fresh and valuable than ever. And so I don't want to go that third way. But in line with that, I see how a critic could think it might be that. that. And what I'm going to have to do in the next session is explain, distinguish between what I would say is the critic picture of Christianity and the actual vibrant living thing that we understand the Christian life to be. And the Christian spirit moving in the lives of believers is just as vibrant today. And that's related to the framework of doctrines, and that's related to the permanence of the truths. And yet the spirit is fresh, and every day is new. And we do see development in theology. I'm not going to get there, unfortunately. But the first thing was to just say up front, I don't want to go the way of Carey Nieuwhof. I don't want to go the way of Karl Barth. But I can see here that more discussion is going to be needed to lay out where I think the prophet is. And that was a lot, and it got really deep pretty quick. I was thinking something nice and light to talk about, like politics, and of course we ended up finding some things to chew on together. So let me throw it over to you maybe for some final thoughts tonight. And I'm not maybe necessarily asking you to respond or rebut, just in your own mind, thinking about the vast vista of Christianity, especially in the Western society, maybe over the last 100, 150 years or so. How do all these factors in your mind set up for what is possibly coming next?
Yeah, it's interesting. I know, and maybe this doesn't get quite into the grand sweep of the church. It's a little more specific, but I know that there's a fellow I know by the name of Paul Vanderklay. He's got a YouTube channel where he talks to a bunch of people and is doing some really interesting things. And Paul has talked a little bit about the need for confessional conversation, the language that he uses. And what he means by that is that on the one hand, we have confessions that deal with very specific things, and we don't really want to get away from that. We don't want to lose those. On the other hand, there are discussions and topics and issues that have arisen in current day and age that just weren't dealt with. The reformers didn't really even have to think about. And his solution to that problem is not to necessarily remain frozen and let's see what the canons of Dort say on this. Let's see what the Heidelberg Catechism, the Westminster Confession, the 1689, let's see what they say about that, since a lot of times they say nothing about those particular items, but rather to have a confessional conversation, meaning that we need to talk through these issues by applying scripture to them and by thinking through these issues in a deep way, in the same way that the folks who were involved in the various confessions during that 100-year period after the Reformation, the late 16th century into the 17th century, were thinking confessionally and having confessional conversations. In fact, 1618, 1619 at Dordrecht in the Netherlands was one big confessional conversation among not just Dutch, but Protestant leaders from all over Western Europe, primarily. And he's suggested that we need to have those confessional conversations. And when you have a confessional conversation, there are certain things that there are certain areas where you basically have to say, look, these are the ground rules. And so he's suggested doing. Now, on some of the issues, he's been talking specifically about some of the issues in my own denomination, which he's also a member of. He's a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church in North America. And has suggested even within that denomination, we need to be having those confession conversations. And it really hasn't happened. But it is interesting because I think your discussion here today, too, just it gets at that idea of what is a confessional conversation. But yeah, so this idea of a confessional conversation, I think, is connected to some of the conversation we're having here today, is how do we think about these? And how do we do so in a way that takes seriously the confessions that we have and the way that we thought about scripture and the way that we gathered those confessions past, but it's meaningful for today for the issues that rise rather than, and so a confessional conversation is different than a dialectic conversation. It's not, let's take our ideas and the new modern ideas and mix match them and syncretize them, but rather it's let's have these conversations about new things, but do them in tried and true ways. So I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion and hearing where we're going to go with it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, my friend. This is a very interesting start to, I think, going to be a fun topic with lots of implications and lots of a chance to. So often we are navigating the daily tactical situations that we face. And I think of this topic as a chance to come up to a higher level and go from the tactical to the strategic. And that's going to be a lot of fun to do. And I think we'll try that for the next time.
Excellent.
So thank you, my friend. This was a great way to open that interesting topic. I'm very grateful to have the text from Bauman to react to and react against. Sometimes we who are critical of particular positions and views owe a gratitude to authors who write these things in ways that we can access them, because so much of my life, Chuck, and you may agree, so much of my life in interacting with people was this idea: why should I stick with something that has ossified, that is this old dead orthodoxy, when I can have this fluidity? And in the case of Bauman, it was a secular modernity. And we Christians are going to have to make our point in the marketplace of ideas. But that's precisely where I think we have the good. We have the deposit of faith given in the scriptures. So I'm excited about next week's discussion, and very grateful to you for reacting to this cold on short notice.
Yeah, no, it's fun. And I'm looking forward to doing that again next week. Good.